You'll understand if that's not you tonight. Those were her father's exact words, in front of 200 guests. At his own retirement dinner, Colonel Griffin Ashworth pointed at his daughter and called her a disappointment who didn't belong at the family table. Sloane Ashworth said nothing. She smoothed her dress. She walked away from her father's table straight toward the four-star general at the front of the room. And when she reached it, 6 of the most decorated officers in the United States military rose to their feet and saluted her. Her father's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips, because the daughter he just humiliated wasn't the washout he thought he raised. She was a commander he never knew existed, and in the next 90 seconds, she would save his life and expose a secret that had been 35 years in the making. The ballroom at Fort Callahan smelled like roses and gun oil, which was exactly the kind of detail nobody else in the room would have noticed, except her. Sloane Ashworth stood near the back wall in a navy dress that cost more than her monthly rent, watching 200 people toast to 35 years of her father's service, like it was the only chapter of the story that mattered. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light across white tablecloths. A string quartet worked through something patriotic and slow. Somewhere near the bar, a colonel's wife laughed too loud at a joke that wasn't funny. And at the head table, under a banner that read "Congratulations, Colonel Griffin Ashworth, 35 years of honor," her father stood with a glass of champagne raised toward the crowd, like a man who had never once been wrong about anything in his life. She used to believe that too, once. Sloane smoothed the front of her dress, waited, because tonight was supposed to be simple. Show up, sit quietly, let the old man have his moment without her complicating it. That was the plan. The plan lasted exactly 4 minutes. Family, Griffin Ashworth said, his voice carrying that particular register he used for command, the one built to travel across a parade ground, the one that made junior officers straighten their spines without meaning to, is the backbone of everything I've done in this uniform. My wife, God rest her. My son, who wears the same insignia I do. And he stopped. His eyes found Sloane across the room, and something in his face closed like a door. And a daughter who reminds me every day that not every soldier finishes what they start. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone has just heard something they weren't supposed to hear out loud. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A waiter froze mid-stride with a tray of champagne flutes trembling slightly in his hands. Sloane didn't move, because moving would mean feeling it, and she had spent 5 years training her body not to feel things in front of an audience. Her brother, Captain Marcus Ashworth, 29, golden boy, the son who wore the uniform right, shifted uncomfortably at the head table. He opened his mouth like he might say something. Their father's hand landed on his shoulder. Not gently. "There's a family table reserved up here," Griffin continued, and his voice had gone from ceremonial to surgical, precise, aimed, "for the people who honored what this uniform means. Sloane." He said her name like a verdict. "You'll understand if that's not you tonight." Somewhere behind Sloane, a woman gasped softly. Somebody's champagne glass clinked too hard against a table edge. Sloane looked at her father, 59 years old, silver at the temples, a jaw that hadn't softened with age, only sharpened like grief carved into granite. He believed every word he'd just said. That was the terrible part. He wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. He was cruel because he was certain, and certainty, Sloane had learned, was the most dangerous weapon in any building. She could have argued, could have raised her voice, could have said something about honor and sacrifice and 5 years of nights nobody would ever know about, could have made a scene that would humiliate them both in front of 200 witnesses. Instead, she smiled. Small, calm, the kind of smile that made people nervous precisely because it didn't match the moment. "Of course, Dad," she said. 2 words. Nothing more, because that was all the room deserved to hear from her tonight. She turned and walked, not toward the doors, not toward the coat check, not toward her car, not toward the exit. Every single person in that ballroom expected a humiliated daughter to flee through with her eyes wet and her dignity in pieces on the marble floor. She walked toward the front of the room instead. toward the long table set beneath the second banner, the one for distinguished guests. 3-star flags on either side of it, place cards written in gold ink. The table where 4-star General Thomas Bracewell sat with his senior staff, men and women whose collars carried more weight than anyone else's in the building. The room watched her go, confused, whispering, because that table wasn't for family who'd been cast out. That table was for people who mattered. Sloane reached it, paused beside an empty chair, the only empty chair at that table, she would realize later, which was not an accident, which had never once in the last 5 years been an accident, and looked at General Bracewell. He looked back at her and smiled like a man greeting an old friend. "Commander," he said, warm, unhurried, loud enough to carry 3 tables in either direction. "We held your seat." And every officer at that table, 6 of them, decorated, senior, some of them men who had commanded battalions, rose to their feet. Not for Griffin Ashworth's daughter. For her. 200 people watched a room full of the United States military's most decorated officers stand up straight and salute a 27-year-old woman in a navy dress. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing Sloane had ever heard in her life. Her father's champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips. His face, that granite, that certainty, cracked. Just slightly. Just enough that Sloane, standing 30 feet away and looking directly at him, saw something she hadn't seen since she was 9 years old. And he'd come home from an overseas deployment with a limp he never explained. Confusion. For once in his life, Colonel Griffin Ashworth did not know what was happening in the room he was standing in. Sloane sat. Because that was the job. Not the speech. Not the scene. Just sit down, exist in the space you've earned, and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own schedule. 5 years earlier, that space hadn't existed for her at all. 5 years earlier, she had been a name in a disciplinary file. Officer Candidate Ashworth, S. Dismissed from advanced training under circumstances the record described in language so bloodless it could have applied to anyone. Conduct unbecoming. Failure to follow protocol during a live exercise. Contributing factor in the death of a fellow candidate. That last line was the one that mattered. That was the line that had followed her home. That was the line her father had read in a letter delivered to their house on a Tuesday afternoon. Standing in the kitchen with his reading glasses low on his nose, and by the time he finished it, his face had already made the decision his mouth would spend the next 5 years repeating. He had not asked her what happened. He had told her what happened, based on 11 paragraphs written by people who were not in the room, and when she tried to explain just once, just for 4 sentences before he cut her off, he had said the words that ended the conversation permanently. "I raised you to tell the truth, even when it costs you something, not to hide behind excuses when a girl is dead because of a decision you made." A girl, Elena Marsh, 22 years old. Sloane's classmate, her friend, the only other woman in a training cohort of 31 candidates, the person who used to trade protein bars with her at 500, because the mess hall didn't open until 600, and neither of them could function on an empty stomach before a 12-mile ruck. Elena Marsh had died on a training exercise that the official report said Sloane mishandled. Sloane had spent every night for 5 years knowing that wasn't true, and spent every one of those nights unable to say so, because the truth was classified in a way that made the lie easier for the government to live with than the reality. And because General Thomas Bracewell had come to her 3 weeks after Elena's funeral, sat across from her in a room with no windows, and offered her the only choice that made any of it survivable. "You can spend the rest of your life defending yourself against a story that isn't true," he'd told her. "Or you can let the story stand, disappear into something the record can't see, and actually finish what you started training for. I can't promise you vindication, Ashworth. I can promise you the truth, eventually, on our terms instead of theirs. Which do you want?" She had wanted, more than anything, to walk into her father's living room and scream the real version of events until he believed her. Instead, she'd said yes to the second option. Because Elena deserved more than a daughter's wounded pride. Elena deserved the actual people responsible for her death to be found. And that required patience Sloane didn't know she had until she was forced to develop it. 5 years. Task Force Obsidian. A designation that existed on no organizational chart anyone outside a 12-person clearance list had ever seen. Sloane had built a career in the space between the lines of her own falsified disgrace, and every single person who mattered in that ballroom tonight, every general, every colonel at that table knew exactly who she was. Every person except the 2 men who shared her last name. The party did not stop for what had just happened. Parties like this never did. String quartets kept playing. Waiters kept circulating with trays of stuffed mushrooms and mediocre champagne. Somewhere across the room, Griffin Ashworth resumed his speech with the practiced smoothness of a man who had learned decades ago how to bury a wound mid-sentence and keep marching. But something in the room had shifted. Sloane could feel it the way she could feel a pressure change before a storm, a subtle physical certainty that the air itself had rearranged. Because now people were watching her, not with pity, not anymore, with something closer to confusion mixed with recalculation, the particular expression of a room full of career military minds trying to reconcile 2 irreconcilable versions of the same young woman. The disgraced washout at the back of the room, the commander seated at General Bracewell's table. Both couldn't be true, except they were. That was the part nobody in the room understood yet. You didn't have to do that, Sloane said quietly to Bracewell once conversation at their table had resumed its low, private hum. The salute. The seat. My father's going to have questions now. Your father's had questions for 5 years, Bracewell said, not looking at her, cutting into a piece of chicken with the unhurried precision of a man who'd once dismantled improvised explosives for a living and never lost the habit of careful hands. He's just been asking the wrong ones. That's not an answer. No, Bracewell agreed. It isn't. Sloane exhaled. Let it go. Because arguing with Thomas Bracewell about strategy was like arguing with gravity, technically possible, functionally pointless. She scanned the room instead. Old habit. The kind of habit that never fully turned off no matter how many champagne toasts were happening around her. Exits. Entry points. Staff movement patterns. Which waiter had circled the same section 4 times without actually serving anyone? Which guest kept checking his watch like it owed him money? Which was how she noticed him. Mid-30s. Catering uniform, black slacks, white shirt. The standard issue bow tie every server in the building wore tonight. Except his shoes were wrong. Polished government issue Oxfords under a rented tuxedo shirt. The kind of detail that would mean nothing to 99 people in this room and everything to the 100th. He was standing near the service corridor at the north end of the ballroom, not serving, watching. Watching General Bracewell's table. Sloane's pulse didn't spike. It never did anymore, not in the way people described in movies. It just sharpened, focused. The rest of the room went soft and unimportant at the edges, while that one man became the only clear thing in her field of vision. Sir, she said quietly, not moving her lips more than necessary, not looking away from her plate. Don't turn around. North Service Corridor. Male, 35 to 40, catering uniform, government shoes. Bracewell's fork paused for exactly 1 second, then continued eating, casual, unbothered. A man discussing nothing more urgent than the wine list. Description. Not local staff. Posture's wrong for someone who's been on his feet all night. He's been watching this table since I sat down. A beat since before I sat down, actually. Which means he was watching it before he knew you'd be here. Which means the target was never me. The 2 of them sat in silence for a moment. 2 people having an entire tactical conversation underneath the polite fiction of a retirement dinner, while 11 feet away a string quartet moved into Something by Elgar, and a room full of unsuspecting guests laughed at toasts and clinked glasses. Options, Bracewell said. Sloane set down her napkin, stood, smoothing her dress, the picture of a young woman excusing herself to find the restroom. I have one, she said. Give me 90 seconds before you signal anyone. Ashworth, 90 seconds, sir. If I'm wrong, I've embarrassed myself at a party. If I'm right, and we spook him with a room full of security, he's got 200 hostages and an exit strategy I don't know about yet. Bracewell studied her for a moment, The same look he'd given her 5 years ago in that windowless room, measuring, weighing, deciding whether the person in front of him was steady enough for what he was about to hand her. 90 seconds, he said. Then I'm moving. Sloane walked. The thing about walking through a crowded ballroom toward a potential threat while wearing 4-inch heels and a dress with no pockets is that nobody teaches you how to do it. Not really. Not the version that matters. They teach you tactical movement in boots and tack gear, weight forward, weapon-ready stance. The choreography of a body built for violence. They don't teach you how to do it smiling. How to nod at a colonel's wife mid-sentence. How to accept a compliment on your dress while your mind runs threat assessment calculations at a speed that would terrify the person delivering the compliment if they knew. Sloane had learned that particular skill the hard way. Because sometimes the mission wasn't a compound in hostile territory. Sometimes the mission was a hotel lobby, a hospital waiting room, a ballroom full of people who loved her father and had no idea what kind of danger had walked in through the kitchen door tonight in a rented tuxedo shirt. She reached the edge of the dance floor, angled toward the bar. Instead of the corridor, never approach a target in a straight line. That lesson lived in her spine now, permanent, and let her path drift naturally toward the north wall, the way a woman might drift toward fresh air after too much champagne. The man in the catering uniform did not look at her, which told her something. A genuinely nervous infiltrator glances at every new person entering his peripheral vision. This man's eyes stayed locked on Bracewell's table with a discipline that took training, real training, which meant he wasn't the only piece on this board. Sloane's stomach tightened, because that meant somebody else was in the room too. She scanned again, faster now, the smile still fixed on her face like a mask bolted in place. Waitstaff, guests, the photographer near the cake table. There, a second man, older, maybe 50, standing near the main entrance with a small earpiece half hidden beneath silver hair, dressed as a guest, badge clipped correctly, credentials that would pass any cursory glance. Except Sloane wasn't giving him a cursory glance. She was giving him the kind of look that came from 5 years of learning exactly what stillness looked like on a person who was actually listening to someone else's voice in their ear. 2 men, coordinated, which meant this wasn't a lone actor with a grudge. This was a team, and her father was standing 40 feet away at a podium with a microphone in his hand, utterly unaware that his retirement party had become a target. Sloane's mind moved fast now, stripped of everything except the calculation. 90 seconds. She'd told Bracewell 90 seconds, and roughly 60 of them were already gone. 2 hostiles confirmed, possibly more. No visible weapons yet, which meant whatever they were planning hadn't started, which meant she still had a window. She reached the man in the catering uniform. "Excuse me," she said, voice pitched exactly like every other slightly tipsy guest in the room. "Is there a restroom back this way?" I got turned around. The man's eyes flicked to her, assessed her in half a second, dress, posture, the particular unbothered ease of someone who belonged here, and dismissed her, which was his first mistake. "Down the hall, ma'am," he said, gesturing vaguely, already returning his attention to the head table. Sloane smiled, thanked him, walked past him toward the corridor exactly as directed. And the moment she was out of his direct sightline, everything changed. Because she didn't go to the restroom. She went into the service corridor, moving fast and silent in heels that had been engineered for elegance rather than speed, until she found what she'd clocked from across the room in the first 4 seconds of watching him: a service cart, half loaded with dessert trays, parked against the wall. Underneath it, wrapped in a linen napkin that didn't quite disguise its shape, was a black case roughly the size of a laptop bag. Sloane's blood went cold and precise at the same time. Both things could be true. Fear and function, running in parallel, the way they always had since the first time she'd learned the difference between panic and preparation. She knelt, unzipped the case just enough to see inside. Wires. A small device with a countdown display, not active yet, sitting dormant like a held breath. Not a bomb in the traditional sense, smaller, more surgical. The kind of device built to disable a room's electronic security systems rather than level a building. which told her everything about the actual objective here. This wasn't an assassination. This was an extraction. Somebody wanted General Thomas Bracewell out of that ballroom, alive. And they wanted the building's cameras and communications blind for the 90 seconds it would take to do it. Sloane's mind sprinted through the math. If she disarmed the device now, the two men in the ballroom would know within seconds that something had gone wrong, and a team desperate enough to attempt an extraction at a retirement party for a 4-star general was a team desperate enough to improvise something violent when their plan collapsed. If she didn't disarm it and let it trigger, the room went dark for however long it took security to restore power. And in that darkness, anything could happen to the 200 people currently laughing at a joke about Griffin Ashworth's early days at officer candidate school. There was a third option, the dangerous one. The one that required her to be faster and steadier than she had any right to be in a cocktail dress with no earpiece, no backup, and 90 seconds that had already become 110. She pulled the device fully into the light and began, with hands that did not shake, to disable it the way 5 years of black site training had taught her, carefully, silently, and completely alone. The device came apart the way most well-built things did once you understood their architecture instead of fearing it. Sloane's fingers moved with a precision that had nothing to do with courage, and everything to do with repetition. 5 years of drills conducted in rooms far less forgiving than a hotel service corridor, until the countdown display went dark, and the wires lay disconnected and harmless against the linen napkin. She exhaled once, allowed herself exactly that much. Then she heard the footsteps, 2 sets, moving fast, moving toward her, the unmistakable rhythm of men who had just realized something had gone wrong with their plan and were coming to find out what. Sloane straightened, had maybe 4 seconds before they rounded the corner, and found her crouched beside their disabled device with zero explanation that would satisfy them. 4 seconds was enough. It had to be. The first man came around the corner, already reaching for something at his waistband. Sloane moved before conscious thought, finished catching up to instinct, a training she'd built specifically for moments, exactly like this one, when the body needed to act faster than the mind could form permission. She drove her palm into his sternum, not to injure, just to disrupt his balance and his draw, and used the half-second of chaos that bought her to close the distance and drive her elbow across his jaw. He went down hard against the service cart, dessert trays crashing to the floor in a spray of crystallized sugar and shattered glass. The second man, the silver-haired one from the entrance, was already reaching for his earpiece, already opening his mouth to call for reinforcements or an abort. And Sloane knew with absolute clarity that she could not let him finish that sentence. She closed the gap in 2 strides, caught his wrist before it reached his ear, twisted, hard, and heard the small, satisfying pop of a joint giving way under pressure it wasn't built for. He gasped, more surprise than pain, and Sloane used his momentary disorientation to sweep his legs out from under him. He hit the corridor floor, didn't get back up. Silence. Just the hum of the building's HVAC system, and faintly, muffled through 2 walls, the sound of a string quartet finishing Pachelbel's canon to polite applause. Sloane stood in the wreckage of a broken service cart, 2 unconscious men at her feet, a disarmed device in a linen napkin, and a navy dress that had somehow survived the entire encounter without a single tear. She straightened her hem, because habits didn't disappear just because the moment had ended. And that was when she heard the 3rd set of footsteps. Slower, deliberate. Someone who had heard the crash and come to investigate, someone who had every reason in the world to be walking down this particular hallway at this particular moment, because it led directly back toward the main ballroom. Sloane turned. Her father stood at the mouth of the corridor, champagne glass still in one hand, eyes moving from the wreckage to the 2 unconscious men on the floor, to his daughter standing over them with her breathing controlled and her hands steady and an expression on her face that he had never once, in 27 years, seen her wear. "Sloane," Griffin said, and his voice, the command voice, the voice that filled parade grounds, came out smaller than she had ever heard it. What did you just do? She looked at her father, at the man who had spent 5 years believing a story that wasn't true, who had stood at a podium tonight and called her a disappointment in front of 200 witnesses, who had no idea that the daughter he'd banished from the family table had just neutralized a threat to the guest of honor with her bare hands while he gave a toast 20 feet away. I kept your party from becoming a headline, she said quietly. That's what I did. Griffin's mouth opened, closed, opened again, searching for the right question among 100 wrong ones. Those men aren't caterers, Sloane finished. General Bracewell needs to know. Now. Before whoever they were working for realizes the plan failed. She stepped past her father without waiting for permission, something she hadn't done since she was 17 years old and furious about a curfew, and moved back toward the ballroom with the same controlled urgency she'd used to walk away from him less than an hour earlier. This time he followed her. The next 10 minutes moved with the strange, compressed velocity of every genuine crisis. Sloane had ever managed a blur that somehow felt both instantaneous and endless. Details sharp and slow even as the clock raced forward. Bracewell absorbed her report in 11 seconds flat, no wasted questions. The response of a man who had received field briefings under artillery fire and understood exactly how much information he needed and how fast. 2 men restrained, breathing, in the service corridor. Device disarmed. Objective appeared to be extraction rather than assassination, meaning someone wanted him alive, which meant someone wanted something from him, which meant this wasn't over. It had just changed shape. Security teams moved in with the efficiency of people who had drilled for exactly this kind of night and hoped never to use it. The 2 unconscious men were removed through a side exit before more than a handful of guests noticed anything unusual, a small mercy, Sloane thought, watching Bracewell's staff work the room with the smooth, practiced calm of professionals trained to manage exactly this kind of quiet catastrophe. The party did not stop. Not really. Most of the 200 guests would go home, tonight having witnessed nothing more than a minor kitchen incident. A few dropped dessert trays, nothing worth remembering by morning. But a small circle of people in that ballroom would remember everything. Griffin Ashworth stood at the edge of that circle now, still holding a champagne glass he had forgotten to set down, watching his daughter debrief a 4-star general in a private alcove off the main hall, with the fluency of someone who had done this 100 times before, because she had. You're certain it was an extraction attempt, Bracewell said, not a question. A confirmation, the kind commanders used when they already believed something and needed the record to reflect it clearly. The device was built to disable security systems, not people, Sloane said. If they wanted you dead, sir, there are far easier ways to accomplish that. At an unsecured retirement dinner, they wanted you gone, quietly, which means someone believes you have something they need and they were willing to risk exposure at a public event to get it. Bracewell's jaw tightened. Voss. The name landed in the small alcove like a dropped glass. Sloane went very still, because that name Gideon Voss was not a name she had heard spoken aloud by anyone outside Task Force Obsidian's 12-person clearance list in 5 years. It was the name she thought about at 2 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. It was the name attached to the training exercise that had killed Elena Marsh, buried under an official record that blamed a 22-year-old candidate instead of the instructor who had actually falsified the safety protocols that night. It was the name Sloane had spent 5 years building a career specifically to bring down. "Sir," she said carefully, aware suddenly of her father standing 8 feet away, close enough to hear every word if his hearing was still what it used to be, and she suspected it was. "We don't have confirmation." "We don't need confirmation," Bracewell said. "We need pattern recognition. This has his signature on it. The precision, the willingness to gamble everything on a single narrow window, the fact that he'd rather extract me alive than risk what I could tell an investigation if he killed me and drew real scrutiny." He exhaled slowly, an old soldier's exhale, the kind that carried 30 years of weight in it. "He's been quiet too long, Commander. Quiet men like Voss don't stay quiet because they've stopped." They stay quiet because they're building towards something bigger than a training accident 5 years ago. Sloane's hands had curled into fists at her sides without her noticing. She uncurled them, deliberately, one finger at a time. "Then we need to move," she said. "We will," Bracewell said. "Tomorrow. Tonight, you're going to do something considerably harder than disarming a device in 4-inch heels." Sloane frowned. "Sir?" Bracewell's eyes flicked, briefly, meaningfully, past her shoulder toward the man standing 8 feet away, still holding a forgotten champagne glass, still processing the fact that his disgraced daughter had just calmly discussed a known threat by name with a 4-star general like they were old colleagues. "You're going to talk to your father," Bracewell said, "because in about 30 seconds, he's going to ask you a question. And for once in 5 years, Commander, I think you're allowed to answer it." Griffin Ashworth waited until Bracewell excused himself, a brief nod, a murmured word about needing to speak with his security detail, the particular grace of a senior officer who understood exactly when a room needed to be cleared for a conversation that wasn't his to witness. Then it was just the two of them, father and daughter, standing in a marble alcove decorated with a banner celebrating 35 years of a career built on the principle that truth mattered more than comfort, a principle Griffin had just watched his own daughter apply to a crisis he hadn't even known was happening, 20 feet from where he'd humiliated her in front of everyone he loved, Sloane. His voice had lost its command register entirely now. What remained sounded almost young, almost afraid. "I need you to explain what I just watched." She looked at him, really looked, not the guarded, controlled glance she'd been giving him for 5 years, the one designed to reveal nothing, but a longer look, searching his face for something she hadn't let herself search for since that Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen, when he'd read a letter and decided, without asking her a single question, exactly who she was. "Which part?" she said quietly. "The part where 2 men tried to disable this building's security to extract a 4-star general, or the part where I stopped them?" "Both." "Either." He set the champagne glass down on a side table with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "You told me you washed out. You told me no." He caught himself. Corrected. "You didn't tell me anything. I told you. I read a report and I decided what happened, and I never once asked you to explain it, because I was so certain the Army wouldn't put something like that in writing unless it was true." He exhaled, and something in his face cracked open further, the granite giving way to something rawer underneath. Was it true? Sloane felt the weight of 5 years pressing against the back of her throat. 5 years of silence she'd chosen for reasons that had felt unimpeachable at the time, protecting an investigation, honoring a promise to Bracewell, refusing to let her own wounded pride compromise a mission bigger than her relationship with her father. But standing here now, watching the man who raised her finally ask the question he should have asked half a decade ago, she understood that some of that silence had also just been easier. Easier than trying to convince a man whose entire identity was built on certainty that he'd been wrong about the most important judgment call of his life. "No," she said. "It wasn't true. Elena Marsh died because the instructor running that exercise falsified the safety protocols. Not because I mishandled anything. I was blamed because it was cleaner than the alternative, because the actual truth would have exposed a training scandal that reached higher than anyone wanted to admit at the time. I've spent 5 years inside a classified task force built specifically to find the man responsible and bring him down properly, with evidence that can't be buried the way Elena's death was buried." Griffin's face went through several things in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, something that looked almost like physical pain, the specific pain of a man realizing he had spent 5 years punishing his own child for a crime she never committed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said, and it wasn't really a question anymore. It was closer to a wound, spoken aloud. "Because you didn't ask," Sloane said, and there was no cruelty in it, just 5 years of exhausted honesty finally given permission to exist in the open air. "You decided. You've always decided, Dad. About Marcus, about me, about what honor looks like, and who's earned the right to sit at your table. You didn't ask me what happened that night. You told me what happened, And then you spent 5 years being right about something that was never true. And I let you, because the alternative was betraying an investigation that mattered more than my own reputation. Griffin was quiet for a long moment. The string quartet in the main ballroom had shifted to something quieter now, a slow waltz drifting faintly through the walls, underscoring a silence that had been building between them for half a decade and had finally cracked open. "The man tonight," he said eventually. Bracewell said a name. "Voss." Sloane's spine straightened. "You heard that? I've been a soldier for 35 years, Sloane. I still know how to listen in a room." He met her eyes, and for the first time all evening, she saw something in his expression that wasn't certainty or command or grief. She saw fear. Real fear, old and specific. "I know that name." The alcove went very still. "House," Sloane said carefully, "do you know that name?" Griffin's jaw worked silently for a moment, the muscles tightening the way they did when he was deciding whether a truth was worth the cost of saying it out loud. Somewhere behind him, through the archway, the party continued laughter, music, 200 people utterly unaware that the evening's real drama had relocated to a quiet marble alcove, where a father and daughter were finally, 5 years too late, telling each other the truth. "Because," Griffin said, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, "Gideon Voss served under my command once. A long time ago, before either of you were born. And there's something about that time I never told your mother, never told Marcus, never told anyone, because I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore." He looked at his daughter, looked at her, the way he should have looked at her 5 years ago in that kitchen, before he'd let a piece of paper decide who she was. "I think it's about to matter very much," he said. "And I think, God help me, I owe you the truth before you find it without me." Sloane felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, exactly. Not yet. Something closer to the sensation of a door creaking open after being sealed shut for years, the promise of air, of light, of a conversation she'd stopped believing they would ever have. "Then start talking," she said. "Because we don't have 5 more years to waste on this, Dad. Whatever you know about Voss, whatever happened between the two of you, it's already reaching for this family. And I need to know exactly how deep those roots go before I can protect any of us from what he's planning next." Griffin nodded slowly, picked the champagne glass back up, looked at it like he'd forgotten why he was holding it, and set it back down again. "It started in '91, he said, during Desert Storm. I was young. I made a decision in the field that I've spent 35 years telling myself was the right one. Voss was there. Voss saw everything. And I think that's exactly why he chose your unit 5 years ago, and exactly why he's willing to risk everything tonight to keep whatever he's building a secret." The waltz drifting through the archway reached its final measures. And somewhere across the city, in an office with no windows and no name on the door, a man who had once served under Colonel Griffin Ashworth was already calculating his next move, because 2 of his people had failed to return tonight, and Gideon Voss had never once in his career let a failure go unanswered. Part 2 morning came to Fort Callahan the way it always did after a night. Nobody official wanted written down. Gray light. Cold coffee going colder in paper cups nobody remembered pouring. And a hallway outside General Bracewell's office that smelled like carpet cleaner and unresolved consequences. Sloane sat in a metal chair that had not been designed for comfort. Because comfort wasn't the point. The point was making people sit up straight while they waited to explain themselves. Except she wasn't the one who needed to explain anything this time. Her father was. Griffin Ashworth stood at the window instead of sitting, hands clasped behind his back, uniform pressed the way it had been pressed every single morning for 35 years. Which told her nothing, because that posture was armor. That posture was the thing he did instead of feeling. "They're going to ask you to distance yourself from me," Sloane said. Quiet. Not a question. Griffin didn't turn around. "I know. They're going to remind you that a public endorsement from a retiring colonel, of an operative from a task force that officially doesn't exist, creates exposure nobody wants." She watched his shoulders, waited for them to move. They didn't. You could say nothing. Let them assume last night was a fluke. Let me disappear back into the classified column where I've lived for 5 years. I could. Would that be easier? Now he turned. And for the first time since she was 17, Sloane watched her father's face do something she hadn't seen it do in a decade. It hesitated. Easier, Griffin said slowly, was never the same thing as right. I built a career pretending those two words meant the same thing. Last night I found out they don't. He crossed the small room, stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up. I'm not distancing myself from anything, Sloane. Not this time. The door opened before she could answer. Bracewell's aide, young, sharp-jawed, clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield, stepped into the corridor. Colonel Ashworth. Commander, he'll see you now. Bracewell's office looked exactly the way command offices always looked. Flags. Framed photographs of men shaking hands in places that no longer existed under the names in the captions. A desk too clean to belong to someone who actually worked at it, because the real work happened somewhere else, in rooms with no windows at all. He didn't stand when they entered, just gestured to the 2 chairs across from him and waited until the door clicked shut behind them. 2 men in custody, he said. No preamble. Bracewell didn't do preamble. Both refusing to talk. Both carrying forged credentials good enough to survive a level 2 background check, which means whoever built those credentials has access most private operators don't. He slid a folder across the desk, didn't wait for either of them to open it. Ballistics on the device your daughter disarmed traces back to a supplier we've flagged twice in the last 18 months. Both times the trail went cold at the same shell company. Voss, Griffin said. Voss, Bracewell agreed. Sloane opened the folder. Photographs. A shipping manifest with half the entries redacted in black bars that told her more than the words underneath them would have. A name she recognized from 5 years of nightmares, buried 3 layers deep in a supply chain designed by someone who understood exactly how paperwork could hide a man as effectively as any wall. He's not hiding anymore, she said. He's operating, openly enough to risk a public event. Which means the timeline moved, Bracewell said. Which means whatever he's building toward, he's close. Closer than we've had him in 5 years. He looked at Griffin, held the look a beat longer than comfortable. Colonel, I need to ask you something, and I need the honest answer, not the diplomatic one. Griffin's jaw tightened. Ask. What do you know about Gideon Voss that isn't in any file I have access to? The room went very still. Sloane watched her father's hands. Because hands told the truth even when faces had spent 35 years learning not to. His fingers curled slightly against his knees. Released. Curled again. In 91, Griffin said, I commanded a forward logistics unit during Desert Storm. Voss was a young lieutenant under my command, sharp, ambitious. The kind of officer everyone assumed would make general before he turned 40. He paused. There was an incident. A supply convoy went missing for 11 hours during a withdrawal. When it turned up, inventory didn't match the manifest, weapons unaccounted for. I wrote it up as combat loss, enemy action, chaos of withdrawal, easiest explanation, and the one that didn't require an investigation nobody wanted in the middle of a war. Was it enemy action? Sloane asked. Griffin met her eyes, and for once didn't look away from the question. No, he said. I suspected Voss diverted that inventory himself. I never proved it. I never tried to prove it, because proving it would have ended a promising young officer's career over a war that was almost finished anyway, and I told myself that made the decision merciful. His voice had gone rough at the edges. I've spent 35 years believing that was mercy. I think now it was the first domino. I think I taught Gideon Voss, in 1991, that a man with the right friends in the right positions could make an entire truth disappear, if the person writing the report decided it was easier that way. Nobody spoke for a long moment, because there wasn't a version of that sentence that didn't land like a diagnosis. You're telling me, Sloane said finally, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, that you made him, that the man responsible for Elena's death, the man who tried to extract a 4-star general out of a retirement party last night, learned how to get away with things because you decided covering for him once was kinder than accountability. Yes, Griffin said. Simple, unflinching, the most honest word she had heard him say in 5 years. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Bracewell exhaled slowly, steepled his fingers. Well, he said, at least now we know where the story starts. Task Force Obsidian did not have a building. It had a floor, 3 levels beneath a nondescript logistics annex on the far side of Fort Callahan, accessible through a service elevator that required 2 separate biometric scans and a code that changed every 72 hours. Sloane badged through the second checkpoint and felt something in her chest loosen the way it always did coming home. Because this was home. Had been for 5 years. More home some days than the house she grew up in. There she is. Master Sergeant Dana Kessler didn't look up from the monitor bank she was hunched over. Dark braid pulled tight. Sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. The woman who body-slammed a government contractor in 4-inch heels. I saw the incident report. I have questions. I have answers, Sloane said. Later. What do we have? We have, said a second voice, dry and precise, a problem shaped like a shell company. Lieutenant Naomi Falk swiveled her chair around, laptop balanced on her knee, reading glasses pushed up into short-cropped hair. 29 years old, former NSA analyst, the kind of mind that saw patterns in noise the way most people saw shapes in clouds. Kessler and I pulled every transaction linked to last night's device supplier going back 3 years. It routes through 11 different holding companies before it lands anywhere real. And where does it land? Falk turned the laptop around. A network diagram bloomed across the screen, nodes and connecting lines. A spiderweb that Sloane had spent 5 years learning to read at a glance. Here, Falk said, tapping a node near the center. A logistics firm operating out of 3 port cities. Officially, agricultural equipment. Unofficially, she scrolled, pulled up a customs manifest, highlighted a line item that meant nothing to an untrained eye and everything to Sloane's. That's a weapons classification code disguised as tractor parts, and it's been running for at least 14 months. Sloane's stomach tightened. Volume? Enough to arm a battalion. Maybe 2. The room went quiet, because that number changed everything. A training accident cover-up was a tragedy contained to one grieving family. A weapons pipeline running for 14 months, disguised inside legitimate shipping, funded by a network sophisticated enough to forge credentials good enough to fool a level 2 background check that was something else entirely. That was a man building an army nobody knew he had. Who's buying it? Sloane said. Kessler pulled up a separate file. Her jaw was tight in a way. Sloane recognized Kessler got quiet like that, right before she said something that mattered. We don't have a confirmed buyer yet, but the shipping routes all terminate in the same region. Eastern approach, 3 different ports, same final destination corridor. She tapped the screen. Castrellia. Sloane closed her eyes for half a second, because Castrellia wasn't a country most Americans could find on a map. A small, fractured state on the eastern edge of a region that had spent the last decade cycling through coups. A place where the line between government forces and organized militia had eroded so thoroughly that international observers had stopped trying to draw it, which made it exactly the kind of place a man like Voss would choose. Nobody asked hard questions about weapons flowing into Castrellia. Everybody already assumed the answer was chaos. He's not just selling weapons, Sloane said slowly. He's selling them to people who'll use classified American intelligence to use them effectively. That's the leak. That's what he needs Bracewell for. Access. Confirmation of troop movement, satellite coverage gaps, something that turns a weapons pipeline into a coordinated operation instead of a black market side business. Falk nodded grimly. That's my read too. So the party wasn't about revenge, Kessler said. It was business. It's always business with Voss, Sloane said. That's what everyone missed for 5 years. Elena's death wasn't cruelty. It was cleanup. She saw something during that exercise she wasn't supposed to see, and covering it up cost less than letting her live to report it. The room absorbed that, because it was one thing to suspect a man capable of murder. It was another thing entirely to say it out loud in a room full of people who had spent 5 years quietly building the case. That would finally prove it. Okay, Kessler said, standing, rolling her shoulders back. So what's the play? Sloane looked at the network diagram glowing on the screen, at the node Falk had highlighted, at 14 months of a pipeline running under everyone's nose, funded and forged and camouflaged by a man who had learned, in 9991, exactly how easy it was to make a truth disappear. We stop the next shipment, Sloane said, and this time we make sure it can't disappear. Captain Reed Calloway arrived 40 minutes later, jacket slung over one shoulder, the particular loose-limbed confidence of a man who had never once in his career doubted his own charm. 32 years old, 3 tours behind him, recruited into Obsidian 18 months ago for his fluency in 3 languages and his talent for making dangerous people believe he was harmless. Did I miss the part where somebody explained why I got pulled out of a perfectly good weekend? He said, dropping into the chair beside Kessler. Or are we still doing the dramatic silence thing? We're doing the dramatic silence thing, Kessler said. Fantastic, love the dramatic silence thing. Sloane almost smiled, almost. Because Calloway's easy patter had been a small mercy inside a task force, built almost entirely out of grief and vigilance. The one voice in the room that could make even a briefing about weapons trafficking sound survivable. Voss is moving a shipment, she said instead, and watched Calloway's face sober instantly, the humor dropping away like a mask that had never fully covered what was underneath it. Castralia bound. Falk traced the network. We have maybe a 2-week window before the next port rotation, and after that we lose visibility on the route entirely. 2 weeks isn't a lot of runway for something this size, Calloway said. It's what we have. Then it's what we use. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, all the loose charm gone now, replaced by the version of him that had survived 3 deployments. What's the target? Falk pulled up satellite imagery, a warehouse complex on the outskirts of a mid-sized port city, gray rooftops and chain-link fencing, the kind of unremarkable industrial sprawl that existed in every port town in the country and drew exactly 0 attention from anyone. This, she said, cross-referenced against 3 separate manifests. This facility is the consolidation point before the shipment splits across the 3 port routes. If we hit it before the split, we catch everything in one location, instead of chasing 3 separate trails across 3 separate cities. And, if we're wrong about the timing, Kessler said, we hit an empty warehouse and lose the 2 weeks we already don't have. We're not wrong, Sloane said, quieter than she meant to, because she needed to be right about this. Needed it in a way that went past professional obligation and straight into something rawer. 5 years of waiting for exactly this kind of window. And she was not going to let doubt cost them the one shot they'd built an entire task force to earn. Calloway studied her for a moment. Something crossed his face, concern maybe, or something closer to it, before he covered it with the easy grin she'd learned not to fully trust, and not to fully distrust either. Then let's not be wrong, he said. Walk me through it. Planning took 6 days. 6 days of satellite passes and shift change patterns mapped down to the minute. Of Falk running facial recognition against grainy security footage lifted from a traffic camera 2 blocks from the target site. Of Kessler drilling entry sequences in a mock-up built inside an empty aircraft hangar until the team could move through it blind, in the dark, without a single wasted step. 6 days of Sloane sleeping 4 hours a night and telling herself that was enough. Because it had to be. Griffin visited the annex twice during those 6 days. Officially, nobody was supposed to know a retired colonel had visibility into a classified task force operation. Unofficially, Bracewell had authorized it, and unofficially, Sloane found herself glad every time her father's silhouette appeared at the top of the service stairwell. The second visit, he found her alone in the planning room at 2 in the morning, staring at a wall covered in printed satellite images and red string that connected them in patterns only she fully understood. You should be asleep, he said. So should you. He came and stood beside her instead. Looked at the wall, at the warehouse, at the red string connecting 14 months of a pipeline nobody had seen until a training accident 5 years ago cracked the first thread loose. I used to do this. he said quietly. Different war. Same wall, basically. Same red string. He was silent for a moment. I used to think the string was the hard part. Finding the pattern. He looked at her. It isn't. The hard part is what you do once you've found it. I know what I'm going to do. I know you do. He studied her face, and something in his expression had softened permanently since the ballroom. Some final piece of granite worn down by 5 years of grief he'd finally allowed himself to feel. I'm not here to talk you out of it. I'm here because I don't know how to help. And I've never in my life been comfortable not knowing how to help the people I love. Sloane looked at her father, at the man who had spent 5 years believing a lie, because believing it was simpler than asking a single hard question, and who had spent the last 6 days trying, clumsily, imperfectly, to become someone who asked hard questions instead. You want to help, she said. Tell me about him, Voss. Everything. Not the version in the file. The version you actually remember. Griffin nodded slowly, pulled a chair over, sat, and talked until the sky outside the annex windows turned gray with morning. The night of the operation arrived cold and clear. A sky full of stars that none of them had time to look at. Sloane moved through the final equipment check with the particular stillness that had replaced nerves somewhere around her. Third deployment with Obsidian, not the absence of fear, exactly, but fear rearranged into something she could use instead of something that used her. Comms check, Kessler said into her mic, crouched beside the vehicle 200 meters from the warehouse fence line. Copy, Falk answered. From the mobile command unit parked 4 blocks away, screens glowing blue against her face. Satellite feeds live. I've got you 3 by 3. Calloway, Sloane said. A beat of static. Then his voice, low, steady, none of the usual humor in it. In position. East entry point. 2 guards. Standard rotation. Nothing that suggests they know we're coming. Copy that. Sloane checked her watch. 247. The consolidation window Falk had flagged ran from 300 to 330 minutes, where the manifest matched the physical inventory before it split across 3 routes and became untraceable again. We move at 0300. In and out in 12 minutes. Falk, eyes on approach roads the whole time. Copy. Kessler, north entry, you're breach and secure. Calloway, east entry. Your documentation, I need photographs of every crate before we touch anything. Chain of evidence has to be clean or this whole thing gets thrown out before it ever reaches a courtroom. Copy, Kessler said. Silence from Calloway's channel. 1 second. 2. Calloway, Sloane said again. Copy, he said. Slightly delayed, slightly off in a way she filed away and didn't have time to examine. 300 came like it always did. All at once, and not fast enough. The breach went clean. Kessler threw the north entry in under 4 seconds. Guards down before either of them registered a threat. The particular controlled violence of someone who had trained for exactly this moment more times than she could count. Sloane followed through the gap. Night vision painting the warehouse interior in ghostly green. Rows of crates stacked in orderly columns that told her everything about how long this operation had been running with zero interference. North secure, Kessler breathed into her mic. East secure, Calloway answered. Half a second later than protocol called for. Sloane's instincts prickled. Filed it away again. No time. She moved down the center aisle, weapon low, eyes scanning crate markings, the same disguised classification codes. Falk had flagged on the manifest. Tractor parts stenciled over what her training told her, with total certainty, were rifle components packed for rapid field assembly. Falk, I need eyes confirming inventory count against the manifest, she said. Crate markers CX14 through CX38. On it, Falk said. A pause. Then sharper, Sloane, I'm reading movement on approach road 2. Vehicle, no lights, moving fast. How fast? Too fast for a scheduled delivery. Another pause, longer, the sound of keys clicking rapid fire. That's not consolidation traffic. That's response traffic. Sloane's blood went cold. They knew we were coming. I don't... Falk's voice cut off, static. Then, second vehicle. Third. Sloane, this isn't a coincidence. This is a response team, and it's arriving way too fast for random bad luck. because random bad luck didn't send 3 vehicles converging on a facility within 90 seconds of a breach that should have been silent and undetected. Someone had told them. "Everybody out," Sloan snapped into her mic. "Now. Kessler, north exit. Go." "Copy. Moving." Gunfire cracked through the warehouse before Kessler finished the sentence. What happened in the next 4 minutes would take Sloan weeks to fully reconstruct, because trauma didn't record memory in order. It recorded memory in fragments, sharp and disconnected, images that surfaced later in the wrong sequence and refused to arrange themselves into anything linear. Muzzle flash, lighting up crate columns in strobing bursts of white. Kessler's voice, calm even under fire, calling out positions, and then not calm. Sharp, a sound Sloan had heard exactly twice before in 5 years, and had hoped never to hear again. "I'm hit. I'm hit. North exit's compromised. I need static." Kessler. Sloan was moving before she consciously decided to move, ducking behind a crate column as rounds sparked off metal shelving 8 feet to her left. "Kessler, say again. What's your position?" "Nothing." "Falk, I need eyes on Kessler's position." "Now. Working on it." The feed's degraded. Someone's jamming. Falk's voice cut again, this time entirely, replaced by a hiss of dead air that told Sloan, with total certainty, that whoever had sent 3 vehicles to a facility that should have been secret also had the technical capability to blind her mobile command unit at exactly the moment it mattered most. This wasn't bad luck. This was a plan. Someone else's plan, executed with a precision that mirrored her own team's training almost exactly, which meant whoever had built it understood Task Force Obsidian's protocols well enough to counter them in real time, which meant the leak wasn't external. The leak was inside the room she'd briefed 6 days ago. Sloan pushed the thought aside with brutal discipline, because Kessler was down somewhere in a warehouse full of gunfire, and there wasn't time to grieve a betrayal she hadn't confirmed yet. She moved low, fast, following the sound of the last exchange of fire, and found her 20 feet from the north exit, slumped against a crate marked CX-19, blood spreading dark across her tactical vest. "Hey." Sloan dropped beside her, hands already moving, pressure on the wound, the muscle memory of training that had never once let her freeze when it mattered. "Hey, look at me. Stay with me." Kessler's eyes found hers, unfocused, fighting to focus anyway. "Somebody knew," she said, voice thin, blood in it now. "Sloan, somebody knew we were coming. Before we even," she coughed, winced. "Before we breached. They were already staged." "I know," Sloan said. "I know. Don't talk. Save it. Calloway." Kessler's hand closed weakly around Sloan's wrist, his calm delay twice. "You caught it too. I saw your face." "Don't talk," Sloan said again, sharper this time, because the alternative was letting herself think the sentence Kessler was trying to finish, and she could not afford to think that sentence, while she still had a hemorrhaging teammate and an active firefight and 0 communication with the rest of her team. She got Kessler moving, half-carried her toward the north exit, weapon in one hand. Kessler's weight against her shoulder, every step a negotiation between speed and the damage speed might cause to a wound she couldn't fully assess in the dark. They made it 11 feet from the exit when the vehicles outside opened fire on the building itself. The next several minutes existed in Sloan's memory as noise and light, and the specific animal focus of pure survival, a version of herself, with no room left for anything except the next 3 seconds, and the 3 seconds after that. She got Kessler out through a gap in the fence line that hadn't been in any of their planning, hadn't existed on any satellite image Falk had shown them, a hole cut recently enough that the metal edges still gleamed under her flashlight. Cut deliberately. Cut for an exit someone had prepared in advance, which confirmed, with total finality, what part of her had already known and refused to accept. Someone inside Task Force Obsidian had built an escape route for this exact scenario, not for the team, for themselves. Falk's voice crackled back online, somewhere around the 3rd minute, static thin and frantic. Sloan, I've got partial visual again. Where's Kessler? Where's Calloway?" Kessler's hit. Bad. Sloan pressed her free hand harder against the wound, feeling the wet heat of it soaking through the fabric between her fingers. I need extraction, north fence line now. On it, 90 seconds out, and Falk. Sloane's voice went very quiet, very level. The calm that lived on the other side of rage rather than the absence of it. Where's Calloway? A pause. Long enough that Sloane already had her answer before Falk gave it. His signal went dark 6 minutes ago, Falk said, right before the vehicles arrived. Extraction happened in a blur of headlights and shouted instructions. Medics swarming Kessler the moment the vehicles stopped. The controlled chaos of a team responding to exactly the kind of catastrophe every training scenario prepared for and every operator hoped never to actually live through. Sloane stood outside the medical tent an hour later, blood-dried dark and stiff across her hands, and watched through a gap in the canvas as a trauma team worked to keep Dana Kessler alive. Bracewell arrived at 430. Didn't say anything at first. Just stood beside her, watching the same gap in the canvas, absorbing the same information she'd already absorbed. 20 minutes earlier, that Kessler was critical but stable, that surgery had gone as well as surgery for a gunshot wound at 3 in the morning. Inside a converted logistics, annex could possibly go, that the next 12 hours would determine everything nobody in this hallway had the power to control. Report, Bracewell said finally. Sloane gave it. Flat, precise. The professional recitation of facts that let her stand upright, instead of collapsing into the specific horror of what those facts actually meant. Breach clean. Inventory confirmed. Response team arriving with a speed and precision that indicated foreknowledge. Comms jammed at the exact moment they mattered most. An exit cut into the fence line in advance for someone who had planned to use it. And Calloway, Bracewell said. Missing, Sloane said. Signal went dark 6 minutes before the response team arrived, which means either he was captured. She paused, made herself finish the sentence, because half-truths didn't survive contact with a man like Bracewell and didn't deserve to survive contact with herself either. Or he was never actually in danger to begin with. Bracewell's face didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened. The specific quality of a man absorbing a piece of information he had already privately feared and hoped never to confirm. You think he's the leak? I think Kessler flagged his comm delay twice, right before she was shot, Sloane said. I think there's a hole cut in a fence line that wasn't on any satellite pass we ran, in a location that gave whoever built it a clean exit toward the same approach road the response vehicles used. I think 6 days of planning happened in a room with exactly 4 people in it. And 3 of us just spent tonight bleeding, running, or standing outside a medical tent that shouldn't exist if the 4th one hadn't sold us out. The words landed heavier than she expected, even having built them herself, sentence by sentence, on the drive back from the warehouse. Bracewell was silent for a long moment. Somewhere behind the canvas, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm. Kessler's heartbeat translated into sound, proof of life that Sloane found herself listening to with a desperation she hadn't let herself feel yet. I need certainty before I authorize anything, Bracewell said finally. Not instinct, not circumstantial timing, certainty. Then give me Falk in 48 hours, Sloane said. Because if I'm wrong, we've accused a man who might be a captive right now, held somewhere by the exact enemy he was trying to help us stop. Her jaw tightened. And if I'm right, every hour we wait is another hour he has to disappear completely, taking everything he knows about this task force with him. Bracewell studied her, and for the first time in 5 years, Sloane watched something in his expression she'd never seen there before. Not command, not calculation, but something closer to grief held carefully in check. 48 hours, he said. And, Commander. His voice dropped quieter than the situation required, quiet enough that it felt almost gentle. I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this is worse than a compromised operation. If Calloway's been feeding information to Voss, he hasn't just endangered a mission. He glanced toward the canvas, toward the steady rhythm of Kessler's monitor. He's had access to everything, every file, every name, every person this task force has ever protected. Sloane felt the floor of her certainty tilt, just slightly, under the weight of that sentence. Because Elena Marsh's real killer had never been caught. Because the man responsible for a 5-year cover-up was still operating freely. Still building an arsenal bound for a war-torn country. Still capable of reaching into a retirement party and nearly extracting a 4-star general in front of 200 witnesses. And now, possibly, still had a source feeding him information from inside the one organization built specifically to stop him. Then we don't wait 48 hours, Sloane said. We move as fast as the truth lets us. Because if Calloway's been talking, Voss already knows everything we know. She looked toward the medical tent one more time. Which means we're not ahead of him anymore, sir. We're behind. And I intend to close that gap before he uses it to hurt anyone else I care about. Falk worked through the following 36 hours with the specific, focused exhaustion of someone converting grief into function, because function was the only thing keeping her upright. Sloane sat beside her for most of it, watching data scroll across 3 monitors, the slow, methodical process of proving a betrayal instead of simply feeling it. It came together in pieces. A financial transfer small enough to avoid automatic flags, routed through an account registered to a shell company that traced after 4 hours of work. Falk described later as the ugliest kind of satisfying, back to the same network that had funded the extraction attempt at the retirement party. A pattern of comm delays across the last 4 operations. Not just the warehouse, each one landing at precisely the moment operational security mattered most. And finally, buried in encrypted metadata, Falk cracked at 300 on the second night. A message, sent from a burner device 6 hours before the warehouse operation. 3 lines. No signature. No greeting. They're moving tonight. Consolidation window 300, 330. Team of 4 north and east entry. Falk read it twice. Sat back in her chair. Pressed both hands flat against her face for a long moment before she spoke. It's him, she said quietly. The device pinged off a cell tower 2 blocks from Calloway's apartment 40 minutes before he left for the briefing that day. Sloane looked at the message on the screen, at 3 lines of text that had nearly cost Dana Kessler her life, that had sent a good man's face into her memory, now permanently rearranged into the shape of a stranger she'd trusted for 18 months. Why, she said, and it wasn't really a question aimed at Falk. It was the question underneath every other question, the one she'd been asking herself since the moment Kessler's hand closed weakly around her wrist in the dark. Why would he do this? She got her answer 4 hours later, when Bracewell called her into his office and slid a single photograph across the desk. A woman, mid-30s, and a child, maybe 6 years old, standing beside her on a playground somewhere with ordinary sunlight and an ordinary swing set, the kind of photograph that belonged in a family album instead of an intelligence briefing. Calloway's sister, Bracewell said quietly, and his niece. Both reported missing 11 days ago. Local police in their jurisdiction have no leads. He let that sit for a moment. I had Falk cross-reference the timeline. 11 days ago is also when Calloway's comm delays started. Sloane felt something in her chest crack open in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Not less angry exactly, but angry alongside something that ached in an entirely different register. He didn't sell us out, she said slowly. He was forced. I don't know that yet, Bracewell said. I know he had a reason a jury would find sympathetic. I don't know that a reason changes what happened to Kessler, or what it costs this task force going forward. His voice hardened slightly. Sympathy isn't the same thing as absolution, Commander. Whatever leverage Voss used against him, Calloway chose to act on it instead of coming to me. That choice cost us a compromised operation and nearly cost us an operator's life. I understand that, Sloane said, and she did, fully, completely, without excuse. I'm not asking you to absolve him. I'm asking you to understand that the man we're hunting didn't just build a weapons pipeline and murder a training candidate 5 years ago. He's still doing this, right now, to Reed's family. Which means wherever Reed is, he's not free. He's a liability Voss will dispose of the moment he's finished using him. Bracewell was quiet for a long moment. Which changes the mission, he said finally. It doesn't change the mission, Sloane said. It clarifies it. We were already hunting Voss. Now we're hunting him with a rescue attached to the front of it instead of an afterthought at the end. She met his eyes. I want Calloway alive when this is over, sir. Not because I've forgiven what he did. Because I understand exactly how a man like Voss builds leverage. And I refuse to let one more person disappear into the space between what he threatened and what he actually did. The rest of that day moved with a strange, brittle quiet, the specific stillness of a team regrouping around a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. Sloane found Griffin in the annex hallway that evening, still in uniform, still there, despite Bracewell technically limiting his access. Standing outside the medical wing with a cup of vending machine coffee he clearly wasn't drinking. "How's the sergeant?" he asked, before Sloane had finished crossing the hallway. "Stable. Surgeons think she'll keep the leg. It's going to be a long recovery." Sloane leaned against the wall beside him, suddenly fully aware of every hour of sleep she hadn't gotten in the last 2 days. She asked about Calloway before they sedated her again. First thing she said when she came out of anesthesia. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That we think Voss has his family. That we're going after him." Sloane closed her eyes for a moment. "Opened them." She said good. Said if it was leverage instead of betrayal, she wants him back too. Even with a hole in her leg he put there by accident, secondhand. A pause. "That's the kind of person she is. I don't know how to be as generous as she is about it yet." Griffin was quiet for a moment. Then he set the coffee down on the windowsill, untouched, and turned to face his daughter fully. "I have something to tell you," he said, "and I don't think you're going to like where it points." Sloane straightened. "Go on." "The board convenes in 3 days," Griffin said. "Formal inquiry into the retirement party incident. Officially, they're reviewing the security breach. Unofficially," he exhaled. "Unofficially, there's a faction that wants to use it to ask questions about Task Force Obsidian's legitimacy, about whether a program that classified could be trusted, given what just happened tonight with an internal leak. They want to shut us down. They want to use tonight's failure as the reason to." Griffin's jaw tightened. "I've been asked to testify about what I witnessed that night, about my daughter's conduct." Sloane felt her stomach drop. "And what are you going to say?" Griffin looked at her for a long moment. The hallway light was harsh and fluorescent, the kind of light that stripped away every soft edge and left only the truth of a person's face underneath it. She watched him decide something, watched the decision settle into his shoulders, permanent, the way decisions did when a man had finally stopped negotiating with his own certainty. "I'm going to tell them the truth," he said. "All of it. What I did in '91. What I let myself believe for 5 years, because believing it was easier than confronting my own daughter with a hard question. And I'm going to tell them that the woman I banished from my family table 3 days ago is the only reason 200 people walked out of that ballroom alive." His voice cracked just slightly on the last few words. "It might end my career's legacy in the history books, Sloane. It might cost this task force its funding if the wrong people decide the story's too messy to protect. But I'm done choosing easier over right. I made that mistake once already, and it cost a young woman her life and my daughter 5 years of a truth she deserved to hear from me, instead of learning from a stranger in a hallway." Sloane looked at her father, at the man who had spent 35 years building a legacy out of certainty, standing in a fluorescent hallway 3 days after that certainty had finally, completely broken open. "Dad." Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "That testimony could end everything you've spent your whole life building." "Some things are worth ending for," Griffin said quietly. "I think I finally understand what your mother used to mean when she said honor isn't the medal. It's what you're willing to lose to keep the truth standing upright." Down the hallway, a monitor beeped steadily behind a closed door, marking out Dana Kessler's slow, stubborn return toward consciousness. Somewhere across the city, in a warehouse that no longer held any evidence because Sloane's team had photographed everything before the shooting started, Gideon Voss was almost certainly recalculating his next move, aware now that his extraction attempt had failed and his warehouse had been compromised, and one member of his network had, however unwillingly, been exposed. And somewhere beyond that, in a location none of them had yet identified, behind a threat aimed at a sister and a 6-year-old niece, with an ordinary swing set in an ordinary photograph, Reed Calloway was still out there. Alive if Sloane's read on Voss's operational patterns held true. Alive and running out of time, 3 days, Sloane said, half to her father, half to the hallway, half to herself. Board convenes in 3 days. We need to find Calloway before then, because if this task force gets shut down before we finish this, Voss wins by default, whether or not we ever prove what he did to Elena. Griffin nodded slowly, picked his coffee back up, didn't drink it, just held it, the way a man held something when his hands needed a task to keep from shaking. Then let's not let him win, he said. And down in the annex 3 floors below them, lights stayed on until morning, while a task force built out of one woman's 5-year silence began the work of turning grief into the last thing Gideon Voss would ever expect from any of them: precision. And, finally, unity, a daughter and a father, working the same wall, the same red string, for the first time in either of their lives. Part 3, the photograph sat on the table between them for a long time before anyone spoke. A woman. A child. A swing set catching ordinary sunlight in a park that could have been anywhere in America. The kind of photograph nobody expected to end up pinned to a whiteboard in a room built for finding monsters. Sloane stared at it until the edges blurred, because that was the thing about grief stacked on grief. It stopped feeling like separate wounds after a while. It just felt like weather. Something you moved through instead of something that happened to you. We start with the sister, she said. Reed never talked about family, not once, 18 months, which means either he didn't have any or he was protecting them on purpose. She looked at Falk. Pull everything. Birth records, employment history, last known address. If Voss found her, there's a trail. Men like him don't disappear people cleanly. They disappear them fast. Falk was already typing. On it. Kessler, Sloane said without turning. How are you not in a hospital bed right now? From the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane she clearly hated, Dana Kessler offered the ghost of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Because lying in a hospital bed while somebody hunts down the man who did this to me sounded like the wrong kind of recovery. She limped to the nearest chair, lowered herself into it with a wince she tried and failed to hide. Don't. I already had this argument with 3 surgeons and Bracewell's chief of staff. I lost none of them. You should have won at least one. I don't lose arguments I actually care about. Kessler's eyes went to the photograph, held there. Something in her face hardened. Is that her? Calloway's sister? And his niece, Sloane said quietly, 6 years old. Kessler didn't say anything for a moment. Then, very simply, find them. It took 11 hours. 11 hours of Falk cross-referencing utility shutoffs against unexplained gaps in a woman's employment record. Of digital footprints that stopped too abruptly to be coincidence. Of a rental car returned 4 states away from where it was rented with mileage that didn't match any reasonable route between the two. Until, at 200, Falk sat back from her monitor with the particular stillness of someone who had just found what she was looking for and didn't like where it pointed. Got them, she said. I think. Sloane crossed the room in 4 steps. Where? A processing facility outside the port corridor. Same region as the warehouse we hit. Officially, it's a defunct cannery. Been empty for 6 years according to public record. Falk pulled up a satellite image, grainy, time-stamped 2 days earlier. Except cannery power grids don't draw this much electricity. And defunct buildings don't get deliveries at 2 in the morning. Sloane studied the image. Rust streaks on a corrugated roof. A single access road. Fencing that looked abandoned from a distance and, on closer inspection, wasn't. That's not a cannery, she said. That's a holding site. I think Calloway's there too, Falk said quietly. There's a secondary structure, smaller, set back from the main building. Environmental control on the roof doesn't match anything a cannery would need. Climate control that precise usually means somebody's keeping people alive on purpose. Not comfortable. Alive. The room went very still, because that sentence, alive on purpose, Not comfortable was the exact shape of the fear Sloane had been carrying since the moment Falk confirmed the burner phone ping outside Calloway's apartment. Voss didn't keep people around out of mercy. He kept them around because they were still useful, which meant there was still time, which also meant that window was closing every hour, whether or not anyone in this room could see the clock. "Bracewell needs this," Sloane said. Now. Bracewell arrived at the annex within the hour, uniform thrown on over what was clearly the middle of an interrupted night's sleep, and studied the satellite image with the particular focus of a man calculating risk in real time. "You want authorization to hit a facility we can't confirm, is what we think it is," he said, "based on power draw and roof equipment. I want authorization to save 2 civilians and 1 operative before Voss decides they've outlived their usefulness," Sloane said. "Sir, with respect, we don't have time to build a stronger case. Every hour we spend confirming is an hour he might spend deciding he doesn't need leverage anymore." Bracewell's jaw worked silently, because she watched him do the math too. The same math she'd already run a dozen times in her head. Risk of a wrong call against a building full of armed traffickers, weighed against the certainty of what happened to hostages once they stopped being useful. "You lost an operative to injury 4 days ago," he said. "I'm not authorizing another full-team insertion without—" "Then send a smaller team," Sloane said. "Me. Falk running Overwatch and comms. Kessler is not cleared for field operations," Bracewell said, sharp. "That's not a discussion." From the doorway where she'd been standing this entire time, cane in one hand, Kessler's voice cut through flat and immovable. "I wasn't asking. Sergeant, with respect, sir, I've spent 4 days in a hospital bed listening to a man I trained apologize to me through a phone call. I'm not even sure." "Voss let him make honestly," Kessler said. "I'm not sitting behind a monitor while somebody else finishes this. I can run support. Perimeter. I don't need a full range of motion to point a rifle in a straight line." Bracewell looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across his face, frustration, maybe. Or something closer to respect, fighting frustration for control of the same expression. "Perimeter only," he said finally. "You do not enter that building. That's not a request. Sergeant, that's an order, and if you violate it, I will have you removed from this task force permanently. Are we clear?" "Clear," Kessler said. "Too fast." Sloane made a mental note to watch her closely once they were on site. Bracewell turned back to the satellite image, studied it another moment. Then, quietly, "You have 6 hours to plan an insertion. I want extraction options mapped before you move, not after. And Commander," his eyes found Sloane's, "if you find Voss himself on site, you do not engage alone. Do you understand me? Whatever he did in '91, whatever he's done since, I need him in custody, not in a body bag. Custody gets us the network. A body gets us nothing but a headline." Sloane held his gaze, thought about Elena Marsh, 22 years old, dead for 5 years under a lie that had cost her family a truth they deserved. Thought about Kessler's leg, about a 6-year-old girl on a swing set who had no idea her mother's disappearance was connected to a weapons pipeline running through 3 ports. "Understood," she said. She wasn't entirely sure it was true. The drive to the processing facility took 4 hours, most of it in silence, because there wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in 6 days of planning and 4 days of watching Kessler relearn how to walk without wincing. Griffin insisted on coming, not into the building. Bracewell had drawn that line with a finality that even Griffin's 35 years of rank couldn't argue past, but into the mobile command vehicle, parked 2 miles out, where he sat beside Falk's monitor bank with the coiled stillness of a man forced to watch a war he couldn't fight in. "You don't have to be here," Sloane told him, adjusting the strap on her vest in the vehicle's cramped rear compartment. "Yes, I do," Griffin said. "Simple. Final. I spent 35 years sending other people's children into buildings like that one, and going home to sleep in my own bed. I'm done doing that to my own." Sloane looked at her father, at the gray in his temples, sharper now under the vehicle's harsh interior light, at the particular stillness of a man who had spent a career being certain and had spent the last week learning, slowly and painfully, how to be something else instead. "Okay," she said, then watched the screen. "And Dad," she paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "If it goes wrong in there, if I don't walk out the way I walked in, I need you to know I don't regret a single day of the last 5 years. Not the silence, not sacrifice, any of it." Griffin's face did something complicated. "Don't talk like that before an op." "I'm not being morbid," Sloane said. "I'm being honest. Something I learned to do again this week, because of you." She smiled, small, real. "Try not to have a heart attack watching the feed." "Sloane." She turned back. "Come home," Griffin said. 2 words. The same economy of language he'd used at the ballroom to banish her, now carrying the opposite weight entirely. "That's an order from your father, not your commanding officer." "Copy that," she said, and stepped out into the dark. The processing facility rose out of the coastal fog, like something built specifically to be forgotten. Corrugated walls, streaked with rust, windows boarded over decades ago, the smell of salt and decay hanging thick over cracked asphalt. Sloane moved along the perimeter fence with Kessler 30 yards behind her. Weapon steady despite the cane she'd abandoned the moment operational movement began, and felt the particular hyperclarity that always arrived right before a breach. Every sound sharpened, every shadow mattered. "Falk," she murmured into her comm. "Confirm layout. Main structure's a single open floor, high ceilings, consistent with old cannery processing equipment." Falk's voice came back, steady despite 4 hours of no sleep. "Secondary structure attached by a covered walkway, southeast corner. That's where the environmental control readings are strongest. If Calloway and the sister are anywhere, that's it." "Guard count?" "Thermals showing 6 inside the main structure. 2 more patrolling the fence line, north and west." A pause. "I count 1 additional heat signature near the secondary structure entrance. Static. Probably a dedicated guard. 9 armed hostiles between her and whatever this building was hiding, and a 2-person insertion team on the ground." Sloane's pulse didn't spike. It sharpened, the way it always did. "Kessler," she breathed. "Fence line north guard. Can you take him quiet?" "Copy," Kessler said, and moved, low and fast, despite everything her leg had been through 4 days earlier. The particular stubbornness that made her exactly the operator Sloane needed beside her tonight, even though every regulation on the book said she shouldn't be here at all. The guard went down without a sound. Kessler dragged him into the fence shadow and reappeared at Sloane's shoulder within 90 seconds, breathing hard but steady. "1 down," she said. 8 to go. "Let's not do them all the same way," Sloane said. "We need the secondary structure. Main building's a distraction we don't have time for unless it comes to us." They moved along the fence line in silence, shadow to shadow, until the covered walkway connecting the 2 structures came into view, and the single guard Falk had flagged, leaning against the entrance with the particular boredom of a man who had been standing in the same spot for hours and had stopped expecting anything to happen. His boredom was his last mistake. Sloane closed the distance in 6 silent steps and had him unconscious against the wall before he registered a threat existed. And for a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel something close to relief. Then the door beside her opened and everything changed. The man who stepped through the doorway wasn't a guard. He wore a suit. Pressed, expensive, entirely wrong for a converted cannery in the middle of the night, and his face Sloane's breath caught, sharp and sudden. Before she forced it back under control, his face matched a photograph she'd studied 1,000 times over 5 years. Older now, grayer at the temples, but unmistakable. Gideon Voss. "Commander Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried the particular calm of a man who had planned for this exact moment, and was pleased to see his planning had paid off. "I confess, I expected you sooner. Your father's testimony to the board isn't for another 2 days. I assumed you'd want this resolved before then." Sloane's weapon was already raised, center mass, and her voice came out flat and controlled despite the roar of adrenaline behind it. "Hands where I can see them." Voss didn't move, didn't reach for anything, just studied her with an expression that was almost fond, the way a chess player might regard an opponent who had finally, after years, made the move he'd been waiting for. "You're not going to shoot me," he said. "General Bracewell needs me in custody." Not a headline. I imagine that instruction came directly from him, given how carefully he's protected you from your own instincts for 5 years. The words landed strangely, wrong in a way Sloane couldn't immediately place. "What does that mean?" she said. "Protected me." Voss smiled. And it was that smile, small, knowing, patient, that told her, with sudden and total certainty, that whatever was about to happen next was going to reshape everything she thought she understood about the last 5 years of her life. "You really don't know," he said. "Extraordinary. He built the entire architecture around you and never once let you see the blueprint." "Voss, Elena Marsh's death wasn't an accident I caused alone," he said, and his voice dropped, quieter now, almost intimate. The tone of a man choosing to deliver a wound with precision rather than force. "It was a variable in a plan far bigger than either of us. Bracewell needed a reason to build a task force that officially didn't exist, staffed by an operative nobody would think to question, because everyone believed she'd already failed once, publicly, completely. Your disgrace wasn't collateral damage, Commander." He tilted his head slightly. "It was the design." Sloane's finger tightened against the trigger guard, every instinct screaming at her to dismiss the words as manipulation, as exactly the kind of lie a cornered man would offer to buy himself 30 more seconds of confusion. Except something in her chest had gone cold and still, because a small, terrible part of her mind was already running the timeline, already remembering Bracewell's windowless room 3 weeks after the funeral, already remembering how quickly he'd offered her a path forward, how neatly it had all fit together, how convenient it had been that the one man positioned to save her career was also the only man who could see her disgrace coming before it fully landed. "You're lying," she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "Ask him," Voss said simply. "When this is over. Ask General Bracewell exactly how much he knew and exactly when he knew it." He spread his hand slowly, the universal gesture of surrender, though his eyes never lost their calm calculation. "I'll come quietly, Commander. I've made my point. The rest of this Calloway, his sister, the child, none of it needs to end badly. I was never planning to kill them. Leverage only works if the person holding it is willing to negotiate." "Where are they?" "Through that door," Voss said, nodding toward the secondary structure behind him, unharmed. "I give you my word." "Your word," Sloane said, "is worth exactly nothing to me." "Perhaps," Voss said, "but it's all I have left to offer, and I suspect you'd rather spend the next 90 seconds confirming they're alive than standing here debating my credibility." He was right. She hated that he was right. Hated the particular cold precision of a man who understood exactly how to weaponize someone else's priorities against them. But he was right, and every second she spent arguing with him was a second Calloway's sister and niece, spent in a building she hadn't yet confirmed was safe. "Kessler," Sloane said, "cuff him. I'm going through that door." The room behind the door was small, windowless, fluorescent lit, furnished with 2 cots and a folding table, and, huddled together on the nearest cot, a woman with Reed Calloway's same sharp jaw and a small girl pressed tight against her side, both of them flinching hard at the sound of the door. "It's okay," Sloane said immediately, weapon lowered, hands visible, every instinct in her softening the moment she registered the child's face. "I'm not with him. I'm here to get you out." The woman Reed's sister, Sloane assumed, though nobody had confirmed a name, yet stared at her for a long, suspicious moment before something in her posture broke, relief flooding in so fast it looked almost like collapse. "Reed," she said, voice cracking. "Is Reed? I don't know yet," Sloane said honestly. "I need you to tell me if you've seen him, if you know where they're keeping him." The woman shook her head, pulling the girl closer. "They separated us 3 days ago. I heard voices sometimes, down the hall. I think," her breath caught, "I think that's him. I think I've been hearing him." Sloane's calm crackled. Kessler's voice, tight and urgent. "Sloane, main structures lighting up. 6 hostiles moving toward the walkway." I don't think Voss's surrender was the whole plan. Of course it wasn't. Sloane should have known, should have factored in, that a man who'd built a 5-year architecture of manipulation, wouldn't simply hand himself over without a contingency running in the background. Get them to the extraction point, Sloane told Falk over comm, already moving toward the hallway the woman had gestured to. I'm finding Calloway. Sloane, that's 6 armed hostiles between you and… I heard you, Sloane said. Get the civilians out. I'm not leaving Reed in this building. She found him in the 3rd room down the hallway, restrained to a chair, a bruise darkening one side of his face, and the particular hollow exhaustion of a man who had spent 11 days being used as leverage against the people he loved most. Sloane. His voice cracked on her name, disbelief and relief tangled together. You shouldn't. How did you? Later, she said, already cutting his restraints, hands moving fast despite the adrenaline making everything feel slightly unreal. Can you walk? I can run if I have to, Calloway said, wincing as circulation returned to his wrists. Sloane, I'm sorry. I never meant… I know, she said. Later. Move. They made it 11 feet into the hallway before gunfire erupted from the main structure, muffled through 2 walls but unmistakable. And Sloane's comm exploded with overlapping voices. Kessler calling out positions, Falk reporting hostile movement, the controlled chaos of a rescue operation that had just become something considerably more dangerous. Sloane, Kessler's voice cut through, breathless. Civilians are clear. They're at the extraction point. But Voss, a pause, sharp with static. Voss is gone. I turned around for 4 seconds to secure the woman and the girl, and he was just gone. Sloane's stomach dropped. Gone how? I don't know. I'm sorry. Not your fault, Sloane said, already moving, half dragging Calloway toward the nearest exit. Get everyone to the vehicles. I'm right behind you. They emerged from the secondary structure into a scene of controlled violence. Bracewell's backup team, called in the moment the situation escalated, exchanging fire with the 6 hostiles from the main building, while Falk's voice cut through every comm channel with the specific urgency of someone counting down a window that was closing fast. And there, at the edge of the fence line, illuminated by the strobing light of gunfire and vehicle headlights, Sloane saw him, Voss, moving toward a vehicle parked at the tree line, moving fast for a man his age, moving like someone who had planned this exact contingency months in advance and had simply been waiting for the right moment to execute it. Get Calloway to the extraction point, Sloane said to the nearest agent, already breaking into a run. I've got Voss. She caught him 20 feet from the vehicle. Not with a bullet, Bracewell's instructions rang loud in her memory. Custody, not a body bag. A body gets us nothing but a headline, but with her body, closing the distance in a full sprint and driving her shoulder into his back with enough force to send them both sprawling across wet gravel. Voss twisted beneath her, faster than a man his age had any right to move, and for a moment they grappled in the mud and fence-line shadow, his hand reaching for something at his waistband that Sloane caught and redirected with a wrench of pure adrenaline-fueled strength. It's over, she gritted out, pinning his wrist, driving her knee into his shoulder blade. Voss, it's over. Nothing's ever over, he said, breathless beneath her. And there was something in his voice now that had lost its earlier calm. Something rawer, more desperate. The sound of a man watching 5 years of careful architecture collapse in real time. You think Bracewell's better than me? You think what he did to you was kindness? Stop talking. He let a girl die, Voss said, and let you carry the blame for it, because it was useful. Because a broken operative with nothing left to lose builds a task force nobody questions. Ask yourself, Commander. His voice dropped, urgent now, desperate to land one final wound before the cuffs closed around his wrists. Ask yourself why he never let you close this case in 5 years. Ask yourself why every lead conveniently led back to me and never once led higher. Sloane's hands were steady as she secured the restraints. Her voice, when it came, was steadier still.
I'm going to ask him,
she said. Every question. And unlike you, he's going to answer them. Because unlike you, he's actually going to have to look me in the eye when he does it. The drive back to the annex passed in a blur. Sloane would spend weeks trying to fully reconstruct Kessler's hand, finding hers at one point wordless and firm, The sound of Calloway's sister crying quiet, exhausted tears of relief in the seat behind them. The particular silence of Griffin watching his daughter through the mobile command vehicle's open door, unable to fully process what he'd just watched unfold. Across a monitor 2 miles from actual danger, Voss was processed into custody by 600, charged formally with crimes that would take federal prosecutors months to fully catalog: trafficking, conspiracy, and, buried beneath layers of statute language, a charge connected directly to the falsified training report that had ended Elena Marsh's life 5 years earlier. By 700, the sun was fully up, and Sloane found herself standing outside Bracewell's office with a question in her chest that had been growing heavier with every mile of the drive back. She knocked, didn't wait for an answer, walked in. Bracewell looked up from his desk, tired in a way she'd rarely seen him. The particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent the night managing a crisis from a distance and hadn't yet processed the fact that it had ended in success. "Commander," he said, "good work tonight, all of it." "Voss said something," Sloane said, closing the door behind her, "before I cuffed him. About Elena. About you." Something crossed Bracewell's face, small, controlled. But Sloane had spent 5 years learning to read the smallest shifts in the faces of men trained not to show anything at all, and what she saw now was recognition, not surprise. Recognition. "Sit down, Commander," he said quietly. "I'll stand." Bracewell studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, and something in his posture changed the careful command, bearing softening into something closer to a man preparing, finally, to set down a weight he'd carried alone for 5 years. "What did he tell you?" Bracewell said. "That Elena's death wasn't just his doing," Sloane said. "That it was useful to you. That my disgrace wasn't collateral. That it was the design." Her voice shook, just slightly, on the last word. "Tell me he's lying, sir." Bracewell didn't answer immediately, and that silence told her everything, before a single word arrived to confirm it. "I didn't kill Elena Marsh," Bracewell said finally. "I want that understood before anything else I say here. Voss falsified those safety protocols. Voss is responsible for her death fully and completely, and nothing I'm about to tell you changes that fact." "But," Sloane said, flat, waiting. "But I knew, within 72 hours, that the official report blaming you was false," Bracewell said. "I had access to enough of the raw data to see the discrepancy almost immediately, and I made a choice." He met her eyes, unflinching now, the confession arriving with the particular steadiness of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind more times than he would ever admit. "I chose not to correct the record." The room went very quiet. "Why?" Sloane said. The single word carried 5 years of grief in it. "Because I'd been building a case against Voss for 18 months before Elena died," Bracewell said. "Suspected trafficking, suspected intelligence leaks. Nothing I could prove, nothing that would survive an internal review, because Voss was careful and well-connected, and I was one general with instincts and no evidence. Elena's death was the first mistake he'd ever made that left a trail, and you—" His voice caught, just slightly. "You were standing in exactly the right position, with exactly the right skill set, to become the operative who could follow that trail without anyone questioning why a disgraced washout had access to sensitive investigations. Nobody watches the woman everyone's already written off. You used my grief," Sloane said, and her voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You used Elena's death. You let my father believe I killed my friend. Let him say those words to me at a kitchen table. Let him carry that belief for 5 years, because it served your investigation." "Yes," Bracewell said. Simple, unflinching. Exactly the same word Griffin had used in this same room, days earlier, confessing his own decades-old failure. "I offered you a choice," Bracewell continued. "I told you that you could spend your life fighting a false story, or disappear into something the record couldn't see and finish what you'd trained for. I never lied to you about that choice, Commander. I let you believe you were choosing patience. I never told you that you were also choosing to become the instrument of an investigation I'd already started, because I believed, and I still believe, that telling you the full architecture at the time would have compromised your ability to operate inside it convincingly. Sloane's hands had curled into fists. That wasn't your decision to make. My father's belief in my guilt wasn't a resource for you to use. No, Bracewell said quietly. It wasn't. And I've carried that particular failure for 5 years, Commander, watching you build a career out of grief I helped manufacture, watching your relationship with your father erode into something neither of you could repair, and telling myself every single day that the mission justified it. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not certain it did. I'm not certain I'd make the same choice again if I were given it back. But I made it, and I owe you the full truth of it now, because Voss was right about one thing tonight. You deserve to hear this from me, not from him. Sloane stood in the silence that followed, feeling something enormous and complicated settle into her chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something closer to the specific vertigo of discovering that even the people who had helped her, who had believed in her, who had given her purpose during the worst years of her life, had also, simultaneously, used her pain as raw material for their own strategic architecture. I need time, she said finally, before I decide what I think about any of this. You're entitled to that, Bracewell said. Take whatever time you need. And Commander. He rose from his chair, slowly, the fatigue of the last 24 hours suddenly visible in every line of his posture. For whatever it's worth, everything you built inside this task force, every operation you ran, every life you protected, that was you. Not my design, you. I gave you an opportunity built on a foundation I'm not proud of. What you did with it was entirely your own. Sloane looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word, because some silences needed to exist before they could turn into anything resembling forgiveness. The board convened 2 days later in a room with too much fluorescent light and not nearly enough air. 11 senior officers seated behind a long table, facing a single witness chair positioned in the center of the room like a spotlight nobody wanted to stand in. Griffin sat in that chair with his back straight and his hands steady, 35 years of service compressed into the particular stillness of a man who had decided, once and finally, that certainty built on silence wasn't worth protecting anymore. Sloane watched from the gallery, Kessler beside her, Kane resting against the seat. Both of them present as witnesses to a testimony that would either preserve or dismantle everything Griffin Ashworth had spent his career building. Colonel Ashworth, the board chair said, you're here to provide testimony regarding the security incident at your retirement dinner and regarding your knowledge of Task Force Obsidian's operations. Do you understand you are under oath? I understand, Griffin said. Then please begin. Griffin was quiet for a moment. Sloane watched his hands steady, she noted, steadier than they'd been in that marble alcove 10 days earlier, and waited. 5 years ago, Griffin began. My daughter was blamed for a training accident that took the life of candidate Elena Marsh. I read the official report. I did not ask my daughter for her account of events. I decided, based on 11 paragraphs written by people who were not present, that I understood what had happened. And I treated my own child accordingly for half a decade. His voice carried across the room, steady, unhurried, the parade ground register put finally in service of something other than command. I was wrong, not partially wrong, completely, catastrophically wrong. My daughter did not cause Elena Marsh's death. A man named Gideon Voss falsified safety protocols to hide his own involvement in a weapons trafficking network, and my daughter has spent 5 years inside a classified task force built specifically to bring him to justice work that, 10 days ago, prevented an assassination attempt at my own retirement dinner, and, 4 days ago, dismantled a trafficking pipeline supplying weapons to an active conflict zone. A murmur moved through the gallery. The board chair's expression didn't change, but her pen had stopped moving against her notepad. I am also here to disclose something I have never before stated in any official record, Griffin continued. In 9991, during Operation Desert Storm, I commanded a forward logistics unit under which Gideon Voss served as a young lieutenant. A supply convoy under my command experienced a discrepancy I privately suspected, and still believe Voss engineered for personal profit. I chose not to investigate. I filed a report attributing the loss to enemy action, believing at the time that I was showing mercy to a promising young officer at the end of a war that was nearly finished. I have spent 35 years believing that decision was an act of grace. His voice roughened, just slightly, the first crack in an otherwise controlled testimony. I now believe it was the origin point of everything that followed. I believe I taught Gideon Voss, 35 years ago, that the right report filed by the right officer could make an inconvenient truth disappear entirely. I believe that lesson shaped the man who later destroyed my daughter's reputation and took an innocent young woman's life to protect a trafficking operation. I am not asking this board to absolve me of that failure. I am asking this board to understand that the woman my task force nearly disqualified from testifying today, based on a lie I helped perpetuate through my own silence, is the reason this network was finally dismantled. The room was utterly silent. I have one final statement, Griffin said, and here, for the first time, his composure genuinely wavered, his voice dropping to something raw and unguarded in front of 11 senior officers and a full gallery of witnesses. 3 weeks ago, at my own retirement dinner, I stood at a podium and publicly humiliated my daughter in front of 200 guests. I told her she did not belong at my family's table. I said those words believing I was protecting the honor of this uniform. He paused, looked briefly toward the gallery, toward Sloan, before returning his eyes to the board. I understand now that I had it backward, completely and shamefully backward. The honor of this uniform was standing in the back of that room the entire time, wearing a navy dress, having spent 5 years protecting people who will never know her name, while I stood at a podium congratulating myself for 35 years of service. I no longer believe I fully understand the meaning of. I am asking this board to evaluate Task Force Obsidian and my daughter's conduct within it, based on the record, not based on a 5-year-old lie I helped keep alive through my own certainty and my own silence. He stopped. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, the particular silence that followed a truth too large to immediately absorb. The board chair finally spoke. "Thank you, Colonel. This board will take your testimony under advisement." Griffin nodded, rose from the witness chair, and as he crossed the room toward the gallery exit, his eyes found Sloane's. And for the first time in 5 years, there was nothing between them except the truth. Finally spoken, finally shared. The board's decision took 6 days to arrive, and when it did, it came in the form of a single sentence delivered by Bracewell's aide to the annex hallway, where Sloane, Kessler, and Falk had spent most of those 6 days, pretending not to wait anxiously for exactly this news. "Task Force Obsidian's charter has been renewed," the aide said, "full funding restored." And Commander Ashworth. He hesitated, the particular hesitation of a young officer delivering news he clearly considered remarkable. "The board's formal record now reflects your role in the Marsh case accurately. The original disciplinary finding has been expunged." Kessler let out a whoop that echoed down the hallway, immediately followed by a wince as her leg protested the sudden movement. Falk pulled Sloane into a hug that lasted a full 10 seconds longer than either of them would normally allow themselves, and Sloane stood in the middle of it, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in 5 years. Not relief, exactly. Not vindication in the clean, satisfying way she'd once imagined it might feel. Something quieter. Something that felt, more than anything, like permission. Permission to finally stop carrying a lie that had never belonged to her in the first place. Elena Marsh's memorial service was held on a gray Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the board's decision, at a small military cemetery an hour outside Fort Callahan, where she'd been buried 5 years earlier under a headstone that had until now told an incomplete story. Sloane stood beside the grave in her dress uniform, the insignia she'd earned inside a classified program finally, formally, visible for the first time at a public event. Beside her, Elena's parents, a quiet, weathered couple who had spent 5 years believing their daughter's death was somehow connected to failures that were never hers, held each other's hands and listened as Sloane spoke. Elena Marsh did not die because of a mistake she made, Sloane said, her voice carrying clearly across the small gathering of family, task force members, and senior officers who had come to bear witness to a truth finally spoken in daylight. She died because she witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see, and because the man responsible for that decision valued his own concealment over her life. I have spent 5 years carrying a version of her death that was never true, and I am here today to make certain that the truth finally outlives the lie. She turned to Elena's parents. Your daughter was the bravest person I trained alongside. She traded protein bars with me at 5 in the morning because neither of us could survive 12 miles on an empty stomach. She never once complained about being the only other woman in a class of 31 candidates. She was going to be extraordinary, and the world was cheated out of finding that out, and I am sorry, more sorry than words can fully carry, that it took 5 years for the truth to reach the people who deserved it most. Elena's mother rose, slowly, and crossed the small distance between them, and pulled Sloane into an embrace that neither of them had known they needed until it happened. Thank you, the older woman whispered, for never stopping. Behind them, standing slightly apart from the gathered crowd, Griffin Ashworth watched his daughter with an expression Sloane had never once seen on his face in 27 years. Pride, unguarded, complete, without a single trace of the certainty that had once made it conditional. The dinner happened 3 weeks later, in the same house Sloane had grown up in, at the same dining table where she'd sat as a child, listening to her father tell stories about honor and sacrifice that she'd once believed described a version of the world simpler than the one she now understood. Griffin had set the table himself, insisted on it over her mother's old friend Carol's offers to help, insisted with the particular stubbornness of a man determined to get one specific thing exactly right after getting so much else wrong for so long. Sloane arrived to find her chair, her actual chair, the one she'd sat in as a teenager, moved back to its original position at the table's center, rather than the far end where it had drifted, unspoken, sometime during the years of distance that had grown between them. You didn't have to do all this, she said, standing in the doorway, watching her father adjust a place setting for the 3rd time. Yes, I did, Griffin said, not looking up. I've had a lot of time to think about what a table is actually for, Sloane. It's not where the worthy sit and the disappointing ones stand outside the door. It's where a family tells each other the truth and stays anyway. I built the wrong kind of table for a very long time. I'd like to try building the right one, if you'll let me. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, still in uniform from a late shift, and stopped short in the doorway at the sight of his sister seated at the head of the table beside their father a seat. Sloane noted that Griffin had specifically arranged rather than left to chance. Well, Marcus said slowly, a grin spreading across his face. This is new. Sit down, Griffin said. Your sister has approximately 5 years of stories she's finally allowed to tell, and I intend to hear every single one of them. Sloane looked around the table, her father, steadier now than she'd seen him. In years, the granite finally softened into something warmer and more honest. Her brother, settling into his chair with the easy comfort of someone who'd never doubted his place here and was watching his sister claim hers for the first time. The empty 4th chair, that had once been her mother's, still set out of habit, a quiet acknowledgement of everyone the table had ever held. Where do you want me to start? She said. The beginning, Griffin said. All of it. I've waited long enough to hear it properly. So she told them about the windowless room, about Bracewell's offer, about 5 years of nights nobody would ever fully understand unless they'd lived them, about Kessler, about Falk, about Calloway's sister, and the 6-year-old girl on the swing set who was, as of last week, back home safely with her mother and an uncle who had finally forgiven himself enough to visit. Griffin listened to every word without interrupting. Once, a silence Sloane recognized now as an entirely different kind than the one he'd offered her for 5 years. Not the silence of a man who had already decided what her story meant. The silence of a man, finally, simply listening. And when she finished, when the story had unspooled fully across a table that had once cast her out, and now, at last, held her exactly where she belonged. Griffin raised his water glass. No champagne tonight, no ceremony. Just an ordinary Tuesday dinner, finally, truly repaired, and looked at his daughter with an expression that carried 35 years of pride he'd simply never learned how to say out loud until now. "To the family table," he said quietly. "Built right, this time." Sloane raised her glass to meet his. Outside, evening settled gently over the quiet street, ordinary and unremarkable. The kind of night that held no headlines and no classified files and no red string connecting anything to anything else. Just a father and a daughter, finally home, finally honest, finally sitting together at the same table where they belonged all along.